They say a mother's love is unconditional, but what they don't tell you is that sometimes that love becomes your prison. My name is Olivia, and I'm 62 years old. For 40 years, I believed my son Lucas was my greatest achievement. Today, I'm sitting in a place I never imagined I'd be, behind locked doors, wearing clothes that aren't mine, listening to nurses who speak about me as if I'm not even here. 3 months ago, I was grieving my husband's death in my own home, surrounded by 40 years of memories. Today, I'm labeled as mentally unstable by the very person I gave life to. Lucas didn't just take my freedom, he took my voice, my dignity, and my right to mourn in peace. It started so quietly, I almost missed it. After Robert's funeral, when the house felt too big and too empty, Lucas began visiting more often. "Mom, you shouldn't be alone," he'd say, his voice carrying what I thought was concern. "You're not thinking clearly since Dad died." At first, I was grateful. My grief was so heavy some days I could barely breathe, and having someone check on me felt like love. But love doesn't forge signatures. Love doesn't pay doctors to write reports about conversations that never happened. Love doesn't have you declared incompetent while you're still trying to figure out how to live without your partner of 38 years. The morning they came for me, I was watering Robert's roses in the garden, the same roses we planted together when Lucas was just 5 years old, running between the bushes with dirt on his hands and joy in his eyes. I heard cars in the driveway and thought Lucas was bringing his family for Sunday dinner, like we used to do when Robert was alive. Instead, 2 men in uniforms walked toward me with papers that would change everything. "Mrs. Olivia Henderson," one of them said, his voice professional but not unkind. "We have an order for involuntary psychiatric commitment. Your son Lucas has filed a petition stating you're a danger to yourself and others due to severe depression and cognitive decline." I stared at him, water still running from the hose in my hand, soaking the ground around my feet. Danger to myself? The only danger I posed was to the weeds in my garden and maybe to my own heart from missing Robert so much it physically hurt. Cognitive decline? I could still balance my checkbook, remember every birthday in the family, and recite Robert's favorite poems from memory. "There must be some mistake," I told them, my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "I haven't seen any doctors recently. I haven't signed anything agreeing to this." But the papers were official, covered in legal language I didn't understand, and signatures that looked like mine but felt foreign under my fingertips. Lucas appeared then, walking across the lawn with the measured steps of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. He wouldn't meet my eyes directly, focusing instead on the officers, on the papers, on everything except the woman who'd stayed up all night when he had pneumonia at 7, who'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his college, who'd celebrated every achievement and comforted every disappointment for 35 years. "Mom, this is for your own good," he said, his tone practiced and calm. "You haven't been yourself since Dad died. The neighbors have called me worried about you talking to yourself in the garden, about you leaving the stove on, about you wandering around at night. Dr. Patterson's evaluation clearly shows you need professional help." Dr. Patterson. I'd never heard that name before in my life. Yet somehow, this stranger had written a detailed report about my mental state, describing symptoms I'd never experienced and conversations that had never taken place. According to his notes, I'd told him I heard Robert's voice calling me to join him, that I'd been forgetting to eat for days at a time, that I'd expressed wishes to end the pain permanently. Every word was a lie. But lies written on official letterhead by someone with medical credentials carried more weight than truth, spoken by a grieving widow who sometimes talked to her deceased husband's photograph. "Lucas, I don't understand," I said, reaching for his arm, but he stepped back as if my touch might contaminate him. "I've been sad, yes. I miss your father terribly, but that's normal grief, not mental illness. I haven't forgotten to eat. You can check my kitchen. I haven't left the stove on. Mrs. Chen next door would have smelled gas. And I certainly haven't talked about hurting myself, but my words bounced off him like rain off a roof. He'd already decided who I was supposed to be in this story, the unstable widow who couldn't cope with reality, whose son was heroically stepping in to save her from herself. The narrative was so neat, so believable, that even I almost wondered if maybe I was losing my mind. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers and it really helps our work. And comment below to let us know what city you're watching from. The ride to the facility felt like a funeral procession, except I was still alive to witness my own burial. Through the car window, I watched my neighborhood disappear, the houses where I'd made friends over decades, the grocery store where everyone knew I preferred paper bags, the church where Robert and I had celebrated our anniversary every year, all of it fading away as I was transported to a place where my words would be symptoms and my memories would be delusions. Riverside Psychiatric Treatment Center looked nothing like the hospitals on television shows. It was clean and modern, with soft lighting and motivational posters that tried to make institutionalization look therapeutic. The intake process was efficient and dehumanizing in equal measure. Forms to sign, belongings to surrender, questions asked by people who'd already read the lies about me and accepted them as fact. "Mrs. Henderson, I'm Dr. Sarah Klein," said a woman who looked young enough to be my daughter, her voice professionally warm but emotionally distant. "I'll be overseeing your treatment plan. According to the documentation from Dr. Patterson, you've been experiencing severe depression with psychotic features following your husband's death. We're going to start you on medication to help stabilize your mood and address the auditory hallucinations." Auditory hallucinations. That's what they called it when I admitted that sometimes, when I was tending Robert's roses, I could almost hear his voice telling me which ones needed more water. That's what became of the comfort I found in imagining conversations with the man I'd loved for 4 decades. The gentle self-soothing that widows have practiced since the beginning of time. "Doctor, I think there's been a misunderstanding," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and rational, proving my sanity through tone, if not through circumstances. "I don't have hallucinations. I sometimes talk to my husband's memory while I'm gardening, the same way people talk to photographs or grave sites. It's how I process my grief, not evidence of psychosis." But she was already writing notes, her pen moving across the paper as she transformed my explanation into symptoms, my grief into pathology. In her world, there was no room for the complexity of human emotion, no space for the different ways people navigated loss. There were only diagnoses to be made and treatments to be prescribed. That first night in my assigned room, lying on a narrow bed with sheets that smelled of industrial detergent, I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand how my life had become someone else's definition of madness. Through the small window, I could see stars that looked the same as they did from my bedroom at home, but everything else felt foreign and wrong. I wasn't crazy. I was heartbroken, confused, and betrayed by the person I'd trusted most in the world. But in this place, those feelings made me a patient rather than a person, someone to be managed rather than heard. And yet, even as tears traced silent paths down my cheeks onto the stiff pillowcase, something inside me refused to surrender. I might be trapped, but I wasn't defeated. I might be labeled, but I wasn't lost. Tomorrow, I would begin the long journey of proving that a mother's love, even when betrayed, could still find a way to fight back. The days here blend together like watercolors in the rain. Tuesday feels like Thursday. Morning bleeds into evening, and I've lost count of how many times I've tried to explain to Dr. Klein that I don't belong here. Each conversation follows the same script. I speak truth. She writes symptoms. I describe my grief. She prescribes medication. I ask to call a lawyer. She suggests I'm becoming agitated. "Medication compliance is essential for your recovery, Mrs. Henderson," she tells me during our weekly sessions, her pen poised to document my response. "The antipsychotics will help quiet the voices you've been hearing." When I insist again that I don't hear voices, she notes, "Patient continues to minimize symptoms in my file." When I ask why my son hasn't visited, she writes, "Shows signs of abandonment anxiety." Every word I speak becomes evidence of my supposed illness. The other patients here are kind, but broken in ways that make me realize how cruel this place can be. Margaret, who's been here for 6 months, whispers that her daughter put her here after she questioned where her late husband's money was going. "Same story as yours," she says during lunch, spooning tasteless soup while keeping her voice low. "Family members who find it easier to call us crazy than admit they're stealing from us." But it's not just stealing, is it? It's the systematic erasure of who we are, the replacement of our voices with medical labels that make us easier to dismiss. I watch the staff interact with us like we're problems to be managed rather than people to be respected. Our memories become delusions. Our emotions become symptoms. Our protests become proof of our illness. Lucas calls Dr. Klein regularly, but never asks to speak with me. I know this because I've heard the nurses discussing his concerned son calls, praising him for being so involved in my care. "Mr. Henderson is such a devoted son," I heard one say to another. "He calls every few days to check on his mother's progress. He's so worried about her. If only they knew that his worry was about me getting better, not worse." During one of these calls, I happened to be walking past the nurse's station when I heard Dr. Klein speaking to him. "She's still in denial about her condition," she was saying, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed she understood my mind better than I did. "She insists she doesn't need medication and keeps asking about legal representation." These are classic signs of paranoid ideation in elderly patients with late-onset psychiatric disorders. Paranoid ideation. That's what they call it when you suspect the people who have power over you might not have your best interests at heart. That's how they describe the rational fear that comes from being locked away by the person you trusted most in the world. I stopped walking and listened, my heart pounding as I heard my son's voice through the phone. "Whatever you think is best, doctor. I just want her to be stable and safe. This is so hard for me. Watching my mother deteriorate like this. I feel guilty that I didn't notice the signs earlier." His voice carried just the right note of pain, the perfect amount of self-blame to make him seem like a loving son facing a difficult situation. The performance was flawless. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have felt sorry for him myself. Here was a man burdened with caring for a mentally ill mother, making the hard choice to seek professional help despite the personal cost. The narrative was so compelling that even I felt a moment of doubt. Was it possible that my grief had affected me more than I realized? Could I be the unreliable narrator of my own story? But then I remembered the roses. Robert's roses that I'd been tending with perfect care until the day they took me away. I remembered my bank account, balanced to the penny. I remembered my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd chatted with me just days before my commitment about her grandson's graduation, commenting on how well I was managing despite my loss. These weren't the memories of someone losing touch with reality. They were the evidence of someone whose reality had been stolen by carefully constructed lies. The medication they give me makes everything feel wrapped in cotton. My thoughts move slower. My emotions feel muffled. And sometimes I have trouble remembering what day it is. "Side effects are temporary," Dr. Klein assures me when I complain about the fog in my brain. "Your clarity will improve as your mental state stabilizes." But I wonder if that's the point, to make me compliant enough to stop questioning, confused enough to doubt my own experiences. During group therapy sessions, I listen to other women tell stories that sound disturbingly familiar. Eleanor, 74, was committed after her stepchildren claimed she was giving away money to imaginary charities. Except the charities were real, and the donations were her way of honoring her late husband's memory. Patricia, 68, ended up here after she threatened to change her will to include a neighbor who'd been helping her with groceries. Her son convinced a judge that this was evidence of financial decision-making impairment. We're not patients, I realize. We're inconveniences. Women who lived too long, remembered too much, or stood in the way of someone else's plans. Our age makes us vulnerable. Our grief makes us sympathetic victims. And our isolation makes us easy targets. Who's going to believe a sad old lady over a concerned adult child with official documents and medical opinions? But I notice something else during these group sessions. We're not as helpless as they want us to believe. Eleanor remembers every detail of her financial situation, despite being labeled as cognitively impaired. Patricia can recite legal precedents from memory, though her son claims she can't remember what she had for breakfast. Margaret keeps a mental inventory of every inconsistency in her daughter's story about why she's here. We're not losing our minds. We're having them taken from us, one lie at a time. The worst part isn't the medication or the locked doors, or even the way staff members speak about us in the third person while we're standing right there. The worst part is the slow erosion of confidence in my own perceptions. When everyone around you insists you're sick, when official documents support their claims, when medical professionals nod knowingly at symptoms you know you don't have, it becomes exhausting to maintain your grip on truth. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself wondering if maybe I really am having memory problems. Maybe I did talk to Robert's ghost more than I remember. Maybe I did forget to turn off the stove or leave doors unlocked. Maybe my grief really has broken something inside my mind that I can't see from the inside. But then morning comes, and I remember Lucas at 7 years old, running through the garden with dirt on his hands. I remember teaching him to tie his shoes, to ride a bicycle, to treat people with kindness and respect. I remember the promises I made at Robert's funeral to keep his memory alive by living fully, not by surrendering to despair. And I remember that the woman who raised that little boy, who loved him unconditionally for 35 years, deserves better than being disappeared by his greed and ambition. I may be trapped in this place, medicated and monitored and treated like I've lost my mind. But I haven't lost my memory, my intelligence, or my determination to prove that love betrayed can still find the strength to fight back. 3 weeks into my stay, I make a decision that will change everything. Instead of continuing to protest my innocence to people who profit from my supposed illness, I start paying attention. I begin to notice patterns, to collect details, to document everything I can remember about how I ended up here. Because somewhere out there, someone is going to listen. Someone is going to see through the lies Lucas has built around me. Someone is going to help me reclaim my voice. I just have to survive long enough to find them. I've become invisible in my own life. That's what happens when they strip away your voice, your choices, your right to be believed. Every morning, I wake up hoping today will be different, that someone will finally listen, that Lucas will remember the mother who sacrificed everything for him. Instead, I get the same routine: medication that clouds my mind, therapy sessions that treat my truth as delusion, and the growing realization that I'm fighting a system designed to keep women like me silent. The humiliation comes in small doses, but it's constant. Yesterday, during lunch, I mentioned to a new patient that I used to run the church bake sale for 15 years, organizing dozens of volunteers and raising thousands of dollars for charity. Nurse Patricia overheard and made a note in my chart. Later, I heard her tell Dr. Klein, "She's having grandiose delusions again, claiming she was in charge of major fundraising events. Classic symptom of her condition. Grandiose delusions. That's what they call it when you remember being competent, when you recall having purpose and respect in your community. A lifetime of achievements becomes evidence of mental illness when it's inconvenient for the people who want to keep you powerless. They've stopped letting me use the phone without supervision. For your own protection," they explain, as if my desire to contact a lawyer or speak to my neighbor Mrs. Chen represents some kind of danger. When I ask specifically to call my bank to check on my accounts, Dr. Klein suggests this is financial fixation related to your anxiety disorder. When I request my husband's death certificate to review some details about our assets, she notes, "Obsessive thoughts about deceased spouse" in my file. Every attempt to take control of my own life becomes another symptom to treat, another reason to keep me here longer. But what breaks my heart most is the way they've convinced Lucas to see me. During his last call, which I wasn't allowed to take, but heard through the thin walls, he told Dr. Klein about his childhood differently than I remember it. "She was always overly involved in my life," he said, his voice carrying a tone I'd never heard before, cold and analytical. Looking back, I can see signs of the controlling behavior that's part of her current condition. She never let me make my own decisions growing up. Controlling behavior. The same love that drove me to attend every school play, every baseball game, every parent-teacher conference has been reframed as pathology. The same dedication that made me work double shifts to pay for his college, sacrifice my own career advancement to support his dreams, cook his favorite meals when he came home for visits, all of it transformed into evidence that I was always mentally unstable. He's rewriting our history to justify what he's doing to me now. Every memory of maternal love becomes proof of my supposed illness. Every sacrifice becomes a symptom of unhealthy attachment. It's easier for him to believe I was always sick than to admit he's destroying a healthy woman for his own gain. The other patients see what the staff refuses to acknowledge. "Your son is cleaning out your house," Margaret tells me during our daily walk in the facility's small courtyard. Same thing happened to me. They need time to transfer assets, change ownership papers, make it look legal. That's why they keep us here. Not for our mental health, but for their financial planning. I try not to think about what Lucas might be doing in my home, but the images come anyway. Robert's watch collection that was supposed to go to our grandson someday. My mother's china set that I've been saving for special occasions that never seem to come. The photo albums documenting 40 years of marriage, 35 years of motherhood, 62 years of a life that apparently doesn't matter to the person I loved most. Is he throwing away the letters Robert wrote me during his business trips? The drawings Lucas made in kindergarten that I kept in a special box? The recipe cards my mother passed down, written in her careful handwriting with notes about which dishes he loved as a child? These aren't just possessions. They're the evidence of love, the proof that I existed as more than just an inconvenience to be managed. During group therapy, Dr. C. Reeves asks us to talk about our support systems and how we can rebuild trust with family members. The irony is so thick I almost laugh. How do you rebuild trust with someone who had you declared insane to steal your inheritance? How do you heal a relationship with a person who would rather have you medicated and institutionalized than admit they need money? I want to work on my relationship with my son, I say, playing along with the therapeutic theater. But I'd like to understand why he felt this was necessary. Could we arrange a family meeting so I can hear his concerns directly? Dr. Reeves and Dr. Klein exchange the kind of look that passes between people who think they're smarter than the person they're discussing. Lucas has expressed that he's not ready for direct contact yet, Dr. Klein explains with practiced sympathy. He needs time to process his own feelings about your condition. Pushing too hard for reconciliation could actually damage your relationship further. They're protecting him from me, the woman who raised him, who loved him unconditionally, who never missed a birthday or graduation or important moment in his life, is now considered too dangerous for a simple conversation. My own son is being shielded from my presence as if grief and confusion were contagious diseases. But I notice something during these sessions that gives me a small spark of hope. There's a young nurse named Emma who watches differently than the others. She doesn't nod along automatically when Dr. Klein describes my symptoms. She asks careful questions about my medical history that suggest she's actually reading my chart, rather than just accepting the narrative. When I mention details about my life before this place, she doesn't immediately write them off as delusions. Mrs. Henderson, she says one afternoon when she's checking my blood pressure, you mentioned you worked at the library for 20 years before you retired. What did you do there? It's such a simple question. But it's the first time in weeks someone has asked about my life as if it were real rather than imaginary. I was head librarian, I tell her, watching her face for signs of disbelief. I managed a staff of 12, organized community programs, oversaw budget planning for new acquisitions. I loved helping people find exactly the book they needed, especially children who were just learning to love reading. She doesn't write anything down. She doesn't mention grandiose delusions or make notes about my supposedly inflated sense of importance. She just listens, nods, and says, "That sounds like meaningful work. You must miss it." It's such a small thing, being believed about something as basic as my own career, but it makes me want to cry with relief. Someone in this place sees me as a person rather than a collection of symptoms. Someone acknowledges that I had a life worth remembering before I became a problem to be solved. Later that day, Emma does something that gives me real hope. She brings me a book from the facility's small library, but it's not the usual self-help material or simple fiction they usually recommend for patients. It's a collection of poetry by Maya Angelou, and she's marked a particular poem with a small piece of paper. "I thought you might enjoy this," she says quietly, making sure none of the other staff members are listening. The poem she's marked is "Still I Rise," and I understand the message she's sending without words. Someone here believes I can rise above this situation. Someone sees strength in me that everyone else insists on calling sickness. That night, reading those powerful words about resilience and dignity in the face of oppression, I make a decision that will change everything. I stop trying to convince people who profit from my imprisonment that I'm sane. Instead, I start documenting everything, every inconsistency in Lucas's story, every lie in my medical records, every witness who can testify to my competence before I was brought here. I may be trapped, medicated, and treated like I've lost my mind, but I haven't lost my intelligence, my memory, or my determination to prove that a mother's love, even when betrayed, can still find the strength to seek justice. Because somewhere in this building is someone who still believes in truth. And with Emma's help, I'm going to find a way to make my voice heard again. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when I received a package that shattered what little hope I'd been clinging to. It arrived during mail distribution, handed to me by Nurse Patricia with the casual indifference of someone delivering junk mail rather than the final blow to a woman's heart. Inside the manila envelope were legal documents, papers I'd never seen, bearing a signature that looked like mine but felt like a stranger's handwriting. It was a power of attorney agreement, dated 3 days before Robert's funeral, giving Lucas complete control over all my financial affairs, medical decisions, and property. According to these documents, I had voluntarily signed away every right I possessed while I was supposedly in the depths of grief-induced psychosis. The signature was perfect, the witnesses were legitimate, and the notarization was official. It was also completely fabricated. I stared at that signature for an hour, tracing the curves and lines with my finger, trying to understand how someone could steal not just your assets but your very identity. This wasn't just theft. It was the complete erasure of my legal existence as an autonomous human being. With these papers, Lucas could make any decision about my life, my money, my future, and I would have no recourse, no voice, no power to stop him. The accompanying letter from his attorney was written in that cold, legal language designed to make cruelty sound professional. Your son has been managing your affairs with the utmost care during your period of incapacity, it read. All decisions have been made in consultation with medical professionals and in accordance with your previously expressed wishes regarding end-of-life care and asset preservation. End-of-life care, as if I were dying instead of grieving, as if my sadness over losing Robert was a terminal illness rather than the natural response of a woman who'd shared her life with someone for 38 years. They'd turned my love into a pathology and my grief into legal incompetence. I sat on my narrow bed that afternoon, holding those papers and feeling something inside me break apart completely. Not my mind. That was still clear, still functioning, still capable of understanding exactly what had been done to me. What broke was my faith that truth mattered, that justice existed, that love could protect you from betrayal when it came from your own child. For the first time since I'd arrived at this place, I stopped fighting. I took my medication without protest, attended therapy sessions without speaking, participated in group activities like a ghost haunting my own life. What was the point of resisting when the law itself had been turned against me? What was the use of maintaining my sanity when sanity was legally irrelevant? Dr. Klein noticed the change immediately and interpreted it as progress. "I'm pleased to see you're becoming more compliant with treatment," she told me during our next session, making notes that probably praised my newfound docility. "This suggests the medication is helping to stabilize your mood and reduce your paranoid ideation about your son's motives." Paranoid ideation. That's what they called it when you correctly suspected that the person with legal power over your life was using that power to destroy you. When your fears turned out to be absolutely justified, they became symptoms of mental illness rather than evidence of rational thinking. The other patients watched me retreat into silence with the understanding of women who'd walked this path before me. Margaret stopped trying to encourage me to fight back. Eleanor quit sharing strategies for documenting the lies in our medical records. Patricia no longer whispered about lawyers who specialized in elder abuse cases. They recognized the moment when hope dies, when the system's cruelty finally succeeds in breaking someone's spirit. But Emma noticed something different. During her evening rounds, she would pause at my bedside longer than necessary, checking my pulse and blood pressure with unusual thoroughness. "Mrs. Henderson," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you okay? You seem different lately. How do you explain to someone that you've just discovered your own child has legally erased you from existence? How do you put into words the moment when you realize that all your maternal love, all your sacrifices, All your dreams for your son's future have been repaid with systematic betrayal? How do you describe the feeling of being buried alive by paperwork while everyone around you congratulates the gravedigger? I'm tired, I told her, which was true but incomplete. I was tired of fighting a battle where the rules changed every time I started winning. I was tired of being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. I was tired of loving someone who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to his financial security. Emma sat down in the chair beside my bed, abandoning her official duties for a moment of human connection. When I was little, she said, her voice still quiet but carrying a warmth that had been missing from my life for months, my grandmother used to tell me that sometimes you have to pretend to be smaller than you are, so that people underestimate you. She said it was a survival strategy for women who lived in a world that wanted to diminish them. I looked at her, this young woman who barely knew me but seemed to understand something essential about what I was experiencing. Why are you telling me this? Because I've been watching you, she said simply, and I've been watching your case. Something doesn't add up about your son's story. The medical records from Dr. Patterson, the timing of your power of attorney, the way your symptoms seem to appear and disappear depending on who's documenting them. None of it feels right to someone who's seen genuine psychiatric emergencies. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stirring in my chest that wasn't despair. Someone with professional training, someone who worked in this system, was questioning the narrative that had trapped me here. Someone was seeing the inconsistencies that everyone else ignored or dismissed. What do you mean? I asked, afraid to hope but unable to stop myself from wanting to believe that truth might still matter to someone. Emma glanced toward the door, making sure we weren't being overheard. Doctor, Patterson's evaluation of you was done on a Tuesday, but according to hospital admission records, he was attending a conference in another state that entire week. The signatures on your power of attorney documents show micro variations that suggest they were traced rather than written naturally. And your son's story about neighbor complaints? I called Mrs. Chen. She's listed as a reference in your admission paperwork. She had nothing but praise for how well you were managing after your husband's death. My heart started beating faster, not with panic, but with something I'd almost forgotten how to feel: hope. Someone had been investigating. Someone had been checking facts instead of just accepting lies. Someone was fighting for me when I'd lost the strength to fight for myself. But I can't do anything official, Emma continued, her voice heavy with the frustration of someone who worked within a system that prioritized liability over justice. I'm just a nurse. I don't have the authority to challenge medical decisions or legal documents. I can document my observations, but that's not enough to get you released. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. But I know someone who might be able to help. There's a lawyer named Sarah Martinez who specializes in elder abuse cases. She's helped other patients who've been trapped in situations like yours. I can't contact her officially, but if someone were to call her... She left the sentence unfinished, placing the paper with the phone number on my bedside table. That night, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day they brought me here. Possibility. Not certainty, not guarantee of success, but the simple knowledge that somewhere in the world, people existed who believed that what was happening to me was wrong. Emma had given me more than just a lawyer's phone number. She'd given me back my dignity, my sense that I deserved to be believed, my understanding that I wasn't crazy for thinking this whole situation was insane. She'd reminded me that sometimes, when you're buried under lies and legal documents and medical labels, you need someone else to start digging. But I still had something that Lucas hadn't been able to steal, forge, or medicate away. I had my memory, my intelligence, and now, thanks to Emma, I had hope. The quiet revolution was about to begin. The change in me wasn't dramatic. It couldn't be. Not in a place where every emotion was monitored and every behavior was documented as either compliance or resistance. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Emma's words had awakened something that all the medication and manipulation couldn't touch. The quiet certainty that I deserved better than this, that my life had value beyond what others could extract from it. I stopped pleading my case to Dr. Klein and started observing instead. During our sessions, I watched how she took notes, noticed which questions she asked, and which concerns she dismissed without investigation. I began to see the patterns in how she interpreted everything I said through the lens of Lucas's narrative, how she transformed normal human responses into symptoms that justified keeping me here longer. When she asked about my relationship with Robert, I started giving her the answers she expected rather than the truth she refused to hear. I miss him terribly, I would say, which was true. Sometimes I feel like I can't go on without him, which was also true but normal for a grieving widow. But now I said it with the tone of someone confessing pathology rather than someone expressing natural grief. Dr. Klein would nod approvingly and write notes about my increased insight into depressive symptoms and growing awareness of my emotional instability. She was so eager to have her diagnosis confirmed that she couldn't see I was giving her a performance rather than authentic revelations about my mental state. The same strategy worked with the nursing staff. Instead of protesting when they brought my medication, I took it without complaint, even though I'd learned to hold the pills under my tongue and spit them out later when no one was watching. Instead of asking repeatedly to use the phone, I stopped mentioning it entirely, letting them believe the medication was reducing my agitation about outside contact. Margaret noticed my new approach during one of our walks in the courtyard. "You're playing their game now," she said with approval, keeping her voice low even though we were outside the main building. "Smart. They can't fix what they think isn't broken anymore." She was right. As long as I appeared to be fighting my situation, they had evidence of my supposed mental illness. A sane person would resist being locked up, would protest against unjust treatment, would demand their rights. But a recovering patient would accept their situation, would show gratitude for the help they were receiving, would demonstrate insight into their condition. It was a trap designed specifically for people like me, women whose sanity was measured by their willingness to accept insane circumstances as normal and necessary. During group therapy sessions, I started sharing carefully crafted stories that supported their narrative while preserving my actual dignity. "I'm beginning to understand that my grief affected my judgment," I would say, watching Dr. Reeves nod with satisfaction. "I can see now that my son was trying to protect me when I couldn't protect myself." The words tasted like poison, but they worked. My progress was noted in my file. My improved insight was mentioned in phone calls to Lucas. My reduced resistance to treatment was cited as evidence that the medication was working and that I was becoming more stable. But while I was performing recovery during the day, I was doing real work at night. Emma had managed to slip me a small notebook, disguised as a gift from the facility's volunteer program. "For writing down your thoughts," she'd said loudly enough for other staff to hear. "Sometimes journaling helps with emotional processing." In that notebook, I began documenting everything I could remember about the weeks before my commitment. Every conversation with Lucas, every detail about my actual mental state, every interaction with neighbors who could testify that I was functioning normally. I wrote down the names of people who knew me, who could vouch for my competence, who had witnessed my grief as normal rather than pathological. I also started paying attention to details about this place that might help Sarah Martinez understand how these facilities operated. The way intake interviews were conducted to emphasize patient statements that supported predetermined diagnoses. The process by which family members could influence treatment decisions without the patient's knowledge or consent. The methods used to justify extended stays for patients whose insurance or assets could support continued treatment. Most importantly, I began collecting evidence about the other women here whose stories paralleled mine. Margaret's daughter had used almost identical language in her commitment petition. Eleanor's medical evaluation contained word-for-word phrases that appeared in my own records, suggesting the reports were templates rather than individual assessments. Patricia's son had hired the same law firm that Lucas was using to manage my affairs. We weren't isolated cases. We were part of a pattern, a system that preyed on elderly women with assets and adult children willing to trade their parents' freedom for financial control. The more I learned about how this worked, the angrier I became. But it was a cold, focused anger rather than the hot desperation that had consumed me when I first arrived. This wasn't emotion anymore. It was strategy. Emma visited my room one evening with news that made my heart race with possibility. "I reached out to Sarah Martinez," she whispered while pretending to check my blood pressure. "I couldn't give her specific details about your case, but I described the general situation. She said she's seen this pattern before, and that there are legal remedies available for people who've been inappropriately committed. She paused, making sure no one was in the hallway. But she needs to hear from you directly. She can't take action based on a nurse's suspicions. She needs the patient to contact her and request representation. The problem is making that contact without it being documented in your medical records. I understood the dilemma. Any attempt to call a lawyer would be noted as evidence of continued paranoid ideation about my situation. Any request for legal representation would be interpreted as lack of insight into my condition. The system was designed to prevent exactly the kind of help I needed. But Emma had thought of that too. There's a patient advocacy program that operates independently from the medical staff, she explained. They're supposed to help patients understand their rights and navigate the system. If you request a meeting with an advocate, that's considered normal and healthy behavior, showing you want to work within the system rather than against it. She handed me a form requesting a patient advocate visit. Fill this out tomorrow and give it to the day shift supervisor. The advocate who covers this facility is named David Chen. He's Mrs. Chen's nephew, actually. When I explained to her what was happening to you, she asked him to pay special attention to your case. Mrs. Chen, my neighbor who'd been worried about me, who'd chatted with me about normal things just days before my commitment, who knew me well enough to recognize that grief wasn't mental illness. She was fighting for me from the outside while Emma fought for me from the inside. For the first time in months, I felt like I had allies rather than just sympathizers. People were taking action on my behalf, using their knowledge and connections to create opportunities for me to help myself. The web of lies that Lucas had woven around me was strong, but it wasn't impenetrable. That night, I lay in my narrow bed and thought about Robert, about the promises I'd made at his funeral to honor his memory by living fully rather than surrendering to despair. He'd loved Lucas too, had believed in him, had trusted him to take care of me if anything ever happened. Robert would be heartbroken to know what his son had become, but he'd also want me to fight back with everything I had. I'm not giving up, I whispered to his memory, to the darkness, to myself. I'm just getting smarter about how I fight. The medication they gave me was supposed to make me compliant, confused, easier to manage. Instead, it had taught me patience, strategy, and the power of appearing to surrender while secretly preparing for war. Tomorrow I would request that patient advocate. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my voice, my rights, my life. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. But tonight, for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. The quiet confidence of a woman who refused to be buried alive. The morning I submitted my request for a patient advocate, Dr. Klein's reaction told me everything I needed to know about how this system really worked. Instead of the approval I expected, after all, patient advocacy was supposed to be a normal part of treatment, she spent our entire session trying to convince me I didn't need outside help. Mrs. Henderson, I'm concerned about this sudden interest in advocacy services, she said, her tone carrying the practiced concern of someone who'd perfected the art of making reasonable requests sound like symptoms. Often, when patients start seeking external validation of their concerns, it indicates they're not fully engaging with their treatment team. We want to make sure you're not developing oppositional behaviors that could interfere with your recovery. Oppositional behaviors. That's what they called it when you tried to exercise your legal rights. When you asked for help understanding your situation, it became evidence that you weren't cooperating with the people who claimed to know what was best for you. The very act of seeking advocacy was being reframed as a sign that I needed more intensive treatment, not less oversight. I just want to understand my rights, I told her, keeping my voice calm and reasonable. I thought that showed I was taking responsibility for my mental health, wanting to work within the system to address my concerns appropriately. She made notes as I spoke, probably documenting my persistent focus on rights and advocacy as another symptom to address. Of course you have rights, Mrs. Henderson, but sometimes when patients are still struggling with insight into their condition, they can misinterpret normal treatment protocols as violations of those rights. That's why we have such comprehensive safeguards in place. Safeguards. The word was a masterpiece of doublespeak. The same system that prevented me from making phone calls was protecting me from my own judgment. The same policies that kept me isolated from anyone who might question my treatment were ensuring my safety. The same procedures that allowed my son to control every aspect of my life were safeguarding my best interests. But despite her objections, she couldn't legally prevent me from meeting with a patient advocate. That protection was built into the state regulations that governed facilities like this one, probably because too many people had been buried in places like this, without anyone ever checking on their welfare. David Chen arrived 3 days later, a quiet man in his 30s who carried himself with the careful professionalism of someone who'd learned that elder abuse cases required delicate handling. He met with me in a small conference room, away from the nursing station with the door closed for privacy. The first real privacy I'd had since arriving at this place. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, settling into his chair with a manila folder that contained copies of my admission paperwork. "I want you to know that everything we discuss today is confidential. I don't report to Dr. Klein or the facility administration. My job is to make sure you understand your rights and that those rights are being respected." For a moment, I almost cried with relief. Someone was speaking to me as if I were a competent adult, rather than a patient whose every word needed to be filtered through medical interpretation. Someone was acknowledging that I had rights that existed independently of what other people thought was best for me. "I also want you to know," he continued, his voice gentle but clear, "that my aunt, Mrs. Chen, asked me to pay special attention to your case. She's very concerned about you, and says the woman she knew as her neighbor bears no resemblance to the person described in these medical records." He opened the folder and began going through my file with the methodical attention of someone who'd seen too many cases where the paperwork didn't match reality. "According to Dr. Patterson's evaluation, you were experiencing auditory hallucinations, memory loss, and had expressed suicidal ideation. But when I contacted Dr. Patterson's office to clarify some details, I discovered some interesting discrepancies." My heart started beating faster. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Dr. Patterson says he never met with you," David said quietly. His secretary confirmed that he was attending a conference during the week this evaluation was supposedly conducted. When I pressed for clarification, she said they'd received several calls recently about evaluations attributed to Dr. Patterson that he never performed. The relief was so overwhelming I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Someone with official authority was confirming what I'd known all along, that the medical evidence against me was fabricated. The foundation of lies that Lucas had built was starting to crumble under actual investigation. David continued reviewing my file, pointing out inconsistencies that became more obvious once someone looked for them. The signature on my supposed consent for treatment didn't match the signature on my insurance forms. The witness statements from neighbors claiming I'd been acting erratically couldn't be verified because the addresses provided didn't exist. The emergency medical assessment that justified my commitment contained medical observations of symptoms that weren't consistent with my actual presentation. "Mrs. Henderson," he said finally, closing the folder and looking at me with the kind of direct attention I hadn't received from anyone in months. "In my professional opinion, you've been the victim of what we call inappropriate commitment, a situation where legal and medical processes have been manipulated to institutionalize someone who doesn't meet the criteria for involuntary treatment." The words hung in the air between us like a Judgment Day revelation. Someone with credentials, someone who understood the system, someone whose opinion carried legal weight was stating officially that what had happened to me was wrong. Not just unfortunate, not just a misunderstanding, but wrong, potentially criminally wrong. "What can we do about it?" I asked, afraid to hope, but desperate to know that options existed. "I'm going to file a formal complaint with the state licensing board about Dr. Patterson's fraudulent evaluation," he said, making notes in his own file. "I'm also going to request an independent psychiatric evaluation from a doctor who has no connection to your son or this facility. And I'm going to contact a colleague of mine, an attorney named Sarah Martinez, who specializes in elder abuse cases." Sarah Martinez, the same lawyer Emma had mentioned, now being recommended by an official patient advocate. The pieces of my rescue were coming together from multiple directions, each person adding their expertise to the growing coalition working to free me from this nightmare. "But I have to warn you," David continued, his expression serious, "this process will take time. The legal system moves slowly, and your son has considerable power over your situation right now. You'll need to continue appearing stable and cooperative while we work behind the scenes to challenge his authority." I nodded, understanding that this was still a performance I'd have to maintain. "How long do you think it will take?" "Weeks, possibly months," he admitted. "But Mrs. Henderson, I want you to understand something important. You're not alone in this anymore. There are people working on your behalf now, people who believe your story and are taking action to help you. You just need to hold on a little longer." That afternoon, when Dr. Klein asked about my meeting with the patient advocate, I was ready with the right answer. "It was very helpful," I told her truthfully. "Mr. Chen explained how the treatment process works and helped me understand that you and the staff are trying to help me get better. I feel more comfortable now about working with the team instead of fighting against it." She smiled with satisfaction and made notes about my improved cooperation and better insight into the treatment process. She had no idea that the advocacy meeting had accomplished exactly the opposite of what she wanted. Instead of making me more compliant with their agenda, it had given me the tools and allies I needed to fight back effectively. That night, I lay in my narrow bed and thought about the coalition that was building around me. Emma, who'd risked her job to investigate my case. Mrs. Chen, who'd refused to accept the lies about my mental state. David, who was using his professional authority to challenge the system from within. And somewhere out there, Sarah Martinez, who specialized in cases like mine and understood how to fight the kind of legal machinery that Lucas had deployed against me. For months, I'd felt like I was drowning in an ocean of lies and legal manipulation, with no one to hear my cries for help. Now I could see the rescue boats approaching from multiple directions, each one bringing expertise and authority that my tormentors couldn't dismiss or discredit. Lucas had made one crucial mistake in his plan to erase me from my own life. He'd assumed that because he could silence me, no one else would speak up on my behalf. He'd underestimated the power of community, the network of people who'd known me before he turned me into a medical file full of symptoms and diagnoses. The tide was turning. I could feel it in the careful way Emma checked on me during her rounds, in the detailed notes David was taking about irregularities in my case, in the growing sense that my voice, silenced for so long, was about to be amplified by people who understood that justice delayed wasn't justice denied. The quiet revolution was gaining momentum, and soon, very soon, Lucas would discover that burying your mother alive requires more than forged documents and bought diagnoses. It requires a world where no one cares enough to dig her back up. That world was disappearing, one ally at a time. The day everything changed started like any other morning at Riverside. I took my medication, or appeared to, attended my therapy session, and participated in the group activities with the same quiet compliance I'd been performing for weeks. But underneath the surface calm, electricity was building. David Chen had called the night before to warn me that Sarah Martinez would be arriving today with court documents that could secure my immediate release. "Be ready," he'd whispered during what appeared to be a routine advocacy check-in. "But don't let anyone know you're expecting this. We need the element of surprise to prevent them from calling your son before we can present our evidence to the judge." I'd barely slept, but I made sure to appear drowsy and medicated during the morning rounds. Nurse Patricia commented approvingly on my improved sleep patterns and reduced anxiety levels, making notes that would later seem ironic given what was about to unfold. Sarah Martinez arrived at 2:47 p.m. I know the exact time because I was watching the clock in the common room, pretending to read a magazine while my heart hammered against my ribs. She walked through the front entrance like justice personified. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of authoritative presence that made people step aside instinctively. She carried a briefcase and wore the expression of someone who'd seen too many elderly people trapped by their own families to have any patience left for institutional nonsense. Behind her walked a man in a suit who turned out to be a court representative, and behind him, like an avenging angel in scrubs, came Emma. The confrontation began in the administrative office, but the raised voices carried throughout the building. Through the thin walls, I could hear Sarah Martinez's voice cutting through Dr. Klein's protests with surgical precision. "Doctor, I have here a court order demanding the immediate release of Olivia Henderson, along with an independent psychiatric evaluation that directly contradicts every finding in her current treatment file. Sarah's voice was calm, but implacable. We also have evidence of fraudulent medical documentation, forged signatures, and what appears to be conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Dr. Klein's response was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deflection. Ms. Martinez, I understand your concerns, but Mrs. Henderson is under the care of qualified medical professionals who have determined she poses a danger to herself. Any changes to her treatment plan would need to be coordinated with her son, who holds medical power of attorney. About that power of attorney, Sarah replied, and I could almost hear the smile in her voice. The document you're referring to was notarized by someone who was out of state on the date in question, witnessed by people who claim they never saw Mrs. Henderson sign anything, and contains a signature that forensic analysis has determined was traced rather than written naturally. The silence that followed was deafening. Then came the sound of papers rustling, chairs scraping, and Dr. Klein's voice rising in what sounded like panic. I'm going to need to call Mr. Henderson immediately to discuss these allegations. No, you're not, the court representative interrupted. Mrs. Henderson is now under court protection pending a full investigation into her commitment. Any contact with Lucas Henderson must go through legal channels. And Dr. Klein, you should know that the state licensing board will be conducting their own investigation into how this facility accepted obviously fraudulent documentation without verification. That's when I heard Emma's voice, clear and strong, providing the kind of detailed testimony that only someone who'd been paying attention could deliver. She described the inconsistencies she'd noticed in my medical records, the suspicious timing of my medication changes, the way my symptoms seemed to fluctuate based on who was documenting them rather than my actual behavior. In my professional opinion, as a registered nurse with 8 years of psychiatric experience, Emma said, Olivia Henderson shows no signs of the conditions described in her admission paperwork. She's been inappropriately medicated, isolated from legal counsel, and denied basic patient rights based on fabricated medical evidence. The door to the common room opened, and Sarah Martinez entered like a liberating army. She walked directly to where I sat, her eyes meeting mine with the kind of recognition that comes when someone sees you as a person rather than a problem. Mrs. Henderson, she said, extending her hand to help me stand. My name is Sarah Martinez, and I'm here to take you home. The word home hit me like a physical force. For months, I'd wondered if I would ever hear those words again, if I would ever walk out of this place as anything other than a broken woman who'd been successfully erased by her own son's greed. Now, suddenly, impossibly, freedom was standing in front of me wearing a business suit and offering me her hand. Dr. Klein appeared in the doorway, her composure cracking under the weight of what was happening. Mrs. Henderson, please don't let these people confuse you. You're making excellent progress in your treatment. Leaving now could be very dangerous for your mental health. I looked at this woman who had spent months treating my sanity as a professional opinion rather than a personal reality, who had prescribed medications to fix problems I didn't have, who had documented my grief as psychosis and my intelligence as delusion. For the first time since my arrival, I was allowed to respond to her as an equal rather than a patient. Dr. Klein, I said, my voice steady and clear. I was never mentally ill. I was grieving, confused, and betrayed by someone I trusted. But I was never psychotic, never delusional, and never a danger to myself or anyone else. What was dangerous was allowing my son to trap me here while he stole my life. The other patients in the common room had stopped pretending to read or watch television. They were witnessing something that rarely happened in places like this. A woman walking out free instead of being transferred to another facility or released into the control of the same family members who'd imprisoned her in the first place. Margaret was crying, her hands pressed to her mouth as she watched me gather the few belongings they'd allowed me to keep. Eleanor reached out to squeeze my arm as I passed her chair. Patricia whispered, "Fight for us too," her voice breaking with hope and desperation. Sarah Martinez must have understood what this moment meant to the women who weren't leaving, because she paused to address the room. "Ladies, if any of you believe your rights have been violated, if any of you have been inappropriately committed or are being held against your will based on questionable evidence, Please know that there are people working to protect elderly patients from abuse. Your voices matter, and your stories deserve to be heard. The ride away from Riverside felt surreal, like awakening from a nightmare to discover that the real world still existed. Through the car window, I watched the facility grow smaller in the distance until it disappeared entirely, taking with it months of my life, but not my dignity, not my sanity, and not my determination to make sure Lucas faced consequences for what he'd done. "Mrs. Henderson," Sarah said as we drove toward my neighborhood, "I need you to know that getting you released was just the first step. We still have to prove that your commitment was fraudulent, recover your assets, and potentially pursue criminal charges against your son. This fight isn't over." I looked at her, this stranger who'd become my champion, who'd seen through Lucas's lies and refused to accept that elderly women could be disappeared so easily. "I understand, and I'm ready to fight. I've had months to think about this, to remember every detail, to prepare for the moment when someone would finally listen to me." As we pulled into my driveway, I saw Mrs. Chen standing in her garden, watering her flowers. When she saw me get out of the car, she dropped her hose and ran across the lawn with tears streaming down her face. "Olivia!" she cried, wrapping me in a hug that felt like coming back to life. "I knew you weren't crazy. I knew something was wrong. I'm so sorry it took so long to get you out of there." Standing in my own driveway, surrounded by people who'd fought for my freedom, looking at the house where I'd lived for over a decade before Lucas decided I was inconvenient to his plans, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. The power of my own voice, validated at last by people who understood that truth mattered more than convenience. The revolution was no longer quiet. It was standing in my garden, holding court papers, and preparing to show Lucas that some graves are too shallow to keep strong women buried. Walking through my front door felt like resurrection. Everything was wrong. The furniture gone, the walls bare, the silence too complete. But I was home. I was free. I was no longer a patient, a case number, a problem to be managed. I was Olivia Henderson, standing in my own house, breathing air that didn't smell of disinfectant and despair. Sarah Martinez had warned me about what I'd find, but seeing the emptiness still hit like a physical blow. Lucas hadn't just stolen my belongings. He'd tried to erase the evidence that I'd ever lived a full, meaningful life. The photo albums were gone. Robert's clothes had vanished. Even my kitchen table where I'd paid bills and written letters for 20 years had disappeared into whatever storage facility or auction house Lucas had used to liquidate my existence. But he'd made crucial mistakes in his haste to claim everything. In the bedroom closet, behind a loose board that he'd never known about, I found the metal box where Robert and I had kept our most important documents. Marriage certificate, birth certificates, Robert's military records, and most importantly, our original wills, the real ones, written 5 years ago, witnessed and notarized properly, leaving everything to me with clear instructions that Lucas would inherit only after my natural death. "This changes everything," Sarah said when I showed her the documents that evening. We sat at Mrs. Chen's kitchen table since mine was gone, spreading papers across the surface like evidence in a trial that was about to begin. "These wills directly contradict the power of attorney he claims you signed. They also establish your mental competence at a time when you were supposedly suffering from early-stage dementia." David Chen had joined us, along with Emma, who'd taken a personal day to help document everything we'd found in the house. It felt surreal to have this team of allies sitting around a kitchen table, planning the legal destruction of my own son's lies, but it also felt like justice finally awakening from a long sleep. "There's more," Emma said, opening a folder she'd brought from the facility. "After you left today, 3 more family members called asking about their relatives' progress. I compared their stories to yours, and the patterns are identical. Same law firm representing the families, same claims about cognitive decline, same mysterious doctor evaluations from Dr. Patterson." She handed Sarah a list of names. "I think Riverside has been running a systematic operation to warehouse elderly patients whose families want control of their assets. The facility gets paid for long-term care, the families get power of attorney, and the patients just disappear into the system." Sarah's expression hardened as she reviewed the information. "This isn't just elder abuse. It's organized fraud on a massive scale. I'm calling the district attorney's office tonight. With your case as evidence and these other victims to interview, we can bring criminal charges that will shut down this entire operation." The next morning brought the confrontation I'd been both dreading and anticipating for months. Lucas arrived at the house, my house, with a moving truck and 2 workers, apparently planning to clear out whatever belongings he'd left behind during his initial theft. He walked up to the front door with the confident stride of someone who owned the place, who had every right to be there, who'd successfully eliminated any obstacles to his inheritance. He didn't know I was home. He certainly didn't expect to find me standing in the living room, no longer medicated, no longer powerless, no longer the broken woman he'd had declared incompetent. "Hello, Lucas," I said when he opened the door with his own key, a key I'd given him years ago when he was still my son instead of my captor. The shock on his face would have been comical if the situation weren't so tragic. He actually stumbled backward, his hand still on the doorknob, staring at me as if I were a ghost who'd somehow escaped from her grave. "Mom, what are you doing here? Dr. Klein said you weren't ready for discharge yet. She said you needed at least 6 more months of treatment before—" "Before what, Lucas?" I interrupted, my voice steady and calm despite the rage burning in my chest. "Before you finish stealing everything your father and I worked 40 years to build? Before you completely erase the inconvenient mother who might ask questions about where her husband's money went?" He tried to recover his composure, switching to the concerned son voice that had fooled so many people for so many months. "Mom, you're confused. You're sick." Dr. Klein explained that sometimes patients have episodes where they think everyone is conspiring against them. You need to go back to the hospital so they can adjust your medication. "I was never sick, Lucas," I said, walking closer to him, watching his face as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "I was grieving. I was heartbroken by your father's death and confused by your sudden interest in taking care of me. But I was never mentally ill, never incompetent, and never a danger to anyone except your plans to steal my inheritance." Behind me, Sarah Martinez stepped into view, followed by David Chen and a police detective who'd been waiting in the kitchen. Lucas's face went white as he realized that this wasn't just an unexpected encounter with his escaped mother. This was an ambush by people who knew exactly what he'd done. "Mr. Henderson," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd destroyed men like him before. "I'm Sarah Martinez, and I represent your mother in several legal matters. We need to discuss the fraudulent power of attorney you used to have her committed, the forged medical documents you submitted to the court, and the theft of assets from her joint accounts." Lucas looked frantically between me and the legal team, probably calculating whether he could still convince someone that I was delusional, that these people were somehow part of my supposed paranoid fantasies. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice rising with desperation. "My mother is mentally ill. She's been hospitalized for months. Whatever she's told you is just part of her condition." Detective Morrison stepped forward, his badge visible on his belt. "Mr. Henderson, we have evidence that Dr. Patterson never conducted the psychiatric evaluation attributed to him in your mother's commitment papers. We also have handwriting analysis showing that signatures on legal documents were traced rather than written naturally. You're going to need to come with us for questioning." The moment when Lucas realized his careful plan was collapsing was almost pitiable. This was the little boy I'd raised, the child I'd protected and nurtured and sacrificed for, watching his world fall apart because of choices he'd made. For just an instant, I felt the old maternal instinct to comfort him, to make everything better, to find a way to fix whatever had gone wrong. But then I remembered the months of isolation, the medication that clouded my mind, the way he'd systematically erased me from my own life while performing concern for doctors and lawyers who never questioned his motives. I remembered Margaret and Eleanor and Patricia, still trapped in that facility, still being treated as problems rather than people because their own children had found it easier to call them crazy than to respect their autonomy. "Lucas," I said as Detective Morrison prepared to escort him from my house, "I want you to know that I loved you unconditionally for 35 years. I would have done anything to help you, given you anything you needed, supported any dream you had. All you had to do was ask." He looked at me then with something that might have been regret, or might have been calculation about whether an apology could still save him. "Mom, But instead," I continued, You decided it was easier to bury me alive than to treat me like a human being who deserved honesty and respect. You turned my grief into a weapon against me, used my love for you as a tool to destroy me. That's not mental illness, Lucas. That's evil. As they led him away, past the moving truck that would now return empty, past the workers who'd been planning to steal what little he'd left behind, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete clarity about who I was and what I deserved. I was Olivia Henderson, 62 years old, widow of Robert Henderson, former head librarian, current survivor of systematic elder abuse. I was a woman who'd been buried alive by betrayal, but had clawed her way back to the surface through truth, determination, and the kindness of people who understood that justice delayed wasn't justice denied. 6 months later, Lucas pled guilty to elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy charges. Riverside Psychiatric Treatment Center lost its license and closed permanently. Dr. Klein faced criminal charges for accepting fraudulent documentation, and 3 other families were reunited with elderly relatives who'd been inappropriately committed. I used part of my recovered assets to fund a legal clinic specializing in elder abuse cases, ensuring that other women like Margaret and Eleanor and Patricia would have advocates who understood that being old and grieving doesn't make you incompetent. It makes you vulnerable to people who mistake vulnerability for opportunity. Standing in my garden today, tending the roses that Robert and I planted together 40 years ago, I think about the lesson this experience taught me. Sometimes the people we love most are capable of the greatest betrayal. Sometimes the systems designed to protect us become the tools used to destroy us. Sometimes justice requires more than just being right. It requires finding people brave enough to help you prove it. But I also learned that truth has a power that lies can never overcome, that love betrayed can still find the strength to fight back, and that sometimes, when you're buried alive by the people you trusted most, the only way to survive is to dig yourself out, one handful of truth at a time. I survived. I fought back. I won. And now, when I water my roses and sometimes talk to Robert's memory about the day's events, I'm not having auditory hallucinations. I'm having conversations with a love that transcends death, speaking truths that no one can ever again mistake for symptoms of mental illness. Because some voices are too strong to be silenced, even by the people who gave us life in the first place.